thank you all to be here. Thank you especially Professor Edward Coulson to accept our invitation. First of all, like any webinar, a preliminary note, because we are going to tape the presentation. So the people who do not allow us to record this webinar could move to the YouTube page and listen the webinar there. Otherwise, if they stay here, it means that they allow us to tape the webinar. Okay, today we have Professor Edward Coulson. Thank you for being here. Professor Edward Coulson is very well known in the field. He's professor in economics and director of the Center for Real Estate at the University of California, Irvine. So thank you for being here also for the jet lag, because you told me that it's very early in the morning. So sorry for wake up so early, but thank you so much for being here. And Professor Coulson has made a lot of research in this field, especially on the measurement of the rent in the consumer price index, the implication for macroeconomic policy, the bias in the rental appraisals. We chat before that he is also using natural disaster for looking at the implication in the housing market. So this is something that we share, very likely for me. He also served as editor for many journals. He's an editor of the journal Regional Science. He's co-editor also of other many journals, the Real Estate Economics, Journal of Urban Economics, Regional Science and Urban Economics, Journal of Housing Economics. And today he's going to present a joint paper on tenant rights, evictions, and rent affordability. I think that if Edward is ready, we could start with the presentation. The format is the usual one, so we have about 35 minutes, 1 hour time for the presentation. Then we have a first round of quick questions before a 5-10 minutes break. And then after the break, we will have a second round of questions. So Edward, the floor is yours. The virtual floor is yours. So you can start whenever you are ready. Thanks a lot.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I hope I am I am audible to everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to this seminar. It's a great pleasure to be in front of you here today. I hope this paper is still very much under construction. So if you have comments or questions or any suggestions at all, we will be very grateful to hear them. So please do make many comments. So the paper is entitled Tenant Rights, Evictions, and Rent Affordability. My co-authors are two former students of mine who have gone on to very nice careers. Thao, who's at Georgia State University, and Lily Shen, who is at Clemson University in South Carolina. So our main motivation for this paper is evictions. And so evictions are, of course, if that word is not familiar, evictions are the forcible removal of tenants by landlords for perhaps non-payment of rent, or perhaps some kind of misbehavior, damage to the apartment. They make too much noise. They're a general nuisance to people. And evictions have gone up quite substantially in the United States over the past decade or so. We did not have data on this until the remarkable work of Matthew Desmond in the 2010s, culminating in this book that he wrote in 2016. And in his work, he has documented that in the United States, I'll talk about more about the data a little bit later, but in the United States, there's 2.3 evictions per year, which is quite a lot. That's, around 1% of the United States population. So that's very serious. And And yes, we could argue about property rights and whether or not landlords have rights to evict tenants for the kind of behavior that they do. But it is undeniable as well that when you are evicted from your housing unit, that there can be some very negative consequences associated with that. So there's been documentation of this in the social science literature that households who are evicted have experienced increased violent behavior by the previous occupants. The children have lower school performance. There's greater incidence of illness. And very, very, very importantly, you are almost unable to get work if you don't have a fixed address. And so you have great employment difficulties when you get evicted. And this, the problems that we're talking about here are especially severe for marginalized groups. So people of color, women, single parents, and so evictions become an important social problem. So now there's policy responses, and these policy responses have gained greater salience in the recent pandemic. So among the more mundane and traditional policy responses are a plethora of regulations that govern the relationship between landlord and tenant, including some that make it more difficult to evict, and we'll talk about some of those later. This increased attention to landlord-tenant relations and a movement towards legislation that is more favorable to tenants is part of a broader movement to impact housing affordability, especially in the coastal parts of the United States. Housing has become quite unaffordable. The rent to income ratios have risen dramatically in many locations. It's over 50%. You're spending more than 50% of your income on rent. And part of that's just because wages haven't risen the way rents have, but part of it is because rents have gotten so high in many places. And there's lots of attention being paid to housing affordability. And creating policies that make it more that are supposed to be more favorable to tenants because it's so hard to find housing, and once you find it, you don't want it's very costly from a social and private point of view to evict those tenants. So in the recent pandemic, we've gone even farther with this. We have implemented in the United States something like an eviction moratorium. So the headline that you see at the top of the page is something that the Trump administration did, and I definitely don't want to get into U.S. politics here, but one of the things that the Trump administration does that's not met with universal disdain is barring evictions due to pandemic job loss. And so, and this is because eviction in a pandemic, evictions have even more dramatic social costs, because if you're homeless and can't shelter in place, it makes you more likely to spread the disease. And so to prevent evictions, even under the most severe non-payment of rent, is regarded as a social good. Now, of course, landlords are terrified about this, and what's interesting about this is that this order, this moratorium on evictions did not come with any landlord relief. In California, there's a bill that's right now being considered in the state legislature to simultaneously prevent, for a longer period of time than the national one would, to prevent evictions, but to provide landlord relief so that landlords don't suffer equally from the pandemic. And so, as I said before, the go-to guy on this is Matthew Desmond, and he has a pair of, the 2016 thing is a book, but there's an important article that was from 2012. So this man is largely responsible for American social science increased attention towards evictions. So, a main piece of the puzzle that we're looking at here is tenant and landlord law. And we know that regulations like these regulations always have trade-offs associated with them. If you benefit one side of a bargain, you're going to hurt the other side of the bargain. And so anything that you do that's favorable to tenants is probably going to be unfavorable to landlords, and that has consequences for the housing market. So these regulations always have these trade-offs associated with them. Tenant landlord law is no exception. And there's some people, I hope you can't hear my dog barking in the background. Sorry about that if you can. Tenant landlord law is no exception. So there's been a couple papers written on the general subject of the evolution of tenant and landlord law, but there hasn't been much research on the consequences of tenant landlord law. And so one of the things we're doing in this paper is trying to fill that gap. But this small literature parallels much broader and more established research on another type of tenant landlord law, which is rent control. And so, as we know, rent control has a wide variety of consequences. It certainly benefits tenants because it lowers rents. That's an obvious benefit to tenants. But one of the things it does also is increase tenure length, the spell length that people have in their housing units. And that's a good thing from the social point of view, because a longer tenure means you're more invested in your neighborhood, you will create more social capital, things like that. So we think that's a good thing. And it also, pertinent to our subject today, it also lowers evictions, because if housing's more affordable, and it's hard to get, rent control lowers the rent that you're paying, and of course, therefore, makes it more likely that you'll be able to stay in your unit. But on the other hand, rent control does impose costs on tenants, because landlords have fewer incentives to keep the apartment in the market, to keep the housing unit in the market. It discourages new development. It encourages conversion to owner-occupied. So in the US, we call this condo conversion. You take a multi-unit apartment building and you kick all the tenants out and you turn it into an owner-occupied condominium. And even if that doesn't happen, landlords have less incentive. If your housing unit's initially worth $2,000 a month, but the rent control says, oh, you only can get $1,500. Well, what you're going to do is you're going to lower the maintenance until the apartment's really only worth $1,500. And we know all these things are true. Every single one of these 6 bullet points are true. And there's been a ton of research demonstrating that. You can see the references at the bottom there. So what do we do in this paper is we try to extend some of that literature to landlord-tenant law. So we do the following things. We construct a theory model which makes predictions on a wide variety of outcomes once you make evictions more difficult. In order to measure the cost of evictions, we develop what we call a Tenant-Right Index for the 50 states plus District of Columbia. That basically what we're trying to do there is establish the extent to which the general legal framework in each state is more or less favorable to tenants versus landlords. And we do this in a panel. So we actually have the index over 25 years, 20 years, I guess. We don't use all that data for reasons which I can state later. And then we use this measure of tenant friendliness and try to correlate it with a number of housing outcomes that are predicted by the theory model, which has, as part of the theory model, the cost of evicting somebody. And so a higher tenant rent index, both according to the theory model and in the empirical outcomes, it reduces evictions, which you actually very much expect. But it also has these negative consequences for housing demanders, which is that it reduces the rental housing supply, it raises rents, and it lowers the vacancy rate. The theory model predicts also that it would actually, surprisingly, a little bit, increase the homeless rate. We don't find that in the empirical work so much, and I think we know the reasons for that. And I'll get to that later. Now, we are not the first to do an economic analysis of landlord-tenant law. we're not even the first to construct a tenants' rights index. So maybe the paper closest to ours is by friends of mine, Brent Ambrose and Musa Diop. They have a real estate economics paper from 2018 that develops a tenant-right index, and they construct a theory model as well, but they only have a cross-section. They use rent bureau data, which is a data set that I've actually used with both of these guys, kind of working in parallel here. The rent bureau data has data on actual leases and and rental performance by the tenants. In other words, how often they pay the rent on time. And their idea is that more tenant rights increase the amount of screening that landlords do, and this higher cost of screening is passed on to the tenants in the form of increased rents. But that increased screening actually improves rental performance. So they're better able to tell whether or not their potential tenants are going to pay their rent, and so they don't approve lease contracts for those that they think are not going to pay rent, and so they get better rental performance out the other end. They're not able to look at a lot of things that we are able to look at, and they don't have a panel, so we're better than them in that sense. Megan Hatch actually has a broader index than ours, but in that paper, there's not much that's done with that. She does show that that in places with lower tenant rights, that tenants don't stay in their units as long. And so there's a little bit of analysis in there, but that paper is mostly meant to just introduce the idea of that we should examine state by state rental regulations. Megan McCollum and Stamira Milcheva have a working paper where they look at a very narrow set of tenant laws and find that because of screening, they don't have a theory model, but they attribute this result to screening, that greater tenant regulation actually lowers, I should say it's the other way, more tenant rights increases net operating income of landlords and REIT performance for multifamily REITs. And then the only other paper we know about so far is a paper by Kolodilin et al. And this is actually a cross-country comparison. So they have very, very narrow set of rules that they're looking at, and not all of them have to do with landlord and tenant rights as such, but they look at some cross-country comparisons, and they find that rents, I don't have the results here, the rents are higher in places that have greater tenant protection. So that's all the literature we know about. So what do we do? Our paper, we think, improves this literature, except for Hatch's very, very extensive paper. A lot of things she looks at don't have anything to do with our topic here today. So we have, I think, a more extensive index than all these other papers, except for Hatch. And where our paper improves on existing US literature is that we have a panel. And so because of the way that our data is constructed, we are able to look at different kinds of outcomes than other papers have been able to do. And we think these are probably more fundamental outcomes, more of interest to policymakers and interested parties. And because it's a panel, we are trying to do some very careful IV approaches. All these other papers did use IVs, but without a panel, it's really, really hard to be able to make any kind of fundamental causal claim about the tenant rights index. So that's the introduction. So I guess I'm not supposed to pause for questions here. I'm just supposed to keep going. So I will, unless someone wants to break in. When I was learning how to teach, they taught me that when you say, "Are there any questions?" that you should always wait 11 seconds before moving on. And I think that's especially true in the Zoom age of lecturing, because students are always 10 seconds behind. So you're probably not 10 seconds behind, but students are always 10 seconds behind. So when you say, are there any questions, you always wait 11 seconds to let the students catch up. So that's what I do. So here's the theory model. So we're going to talk about landlords first. There's landlords and there's tenants. And so tenants are demanding 1 unit of housing. Landlords are supplying 1 unit of housing. They come together in the market and try to match with the other side if the landlord has a vacancy and if the tenant is currently without a housing unit. Let's talk about landlords first. Landlords have a property. That property is in one of 2 states. It's either occupied or vacant. If it's vacant, they're going to have a carrying cost of C, and they're going to wait for tenants to match with some matching rate lambda. Now, if you're familiar with these Diamond, Mortensen, Pisaridi search and matching models, this is all very, very standard. So you can see here, if you can follow the cursor, so this on the left-hand side, this is the flow value, because R is a discount rate. It's a flow value of having a unit in a vacant state. So pi is a lifetime kind of profit function for landlords. And so R pi V is the flow value of that. And so in a microcosmically small unit of time, these are continuous time models. And so I'll fall into this trap probably, but you can't call these things probabilities because the time period is infinitesimally small. So you call them rates. So anyway, the flow value of a vacancy is you have to pay the carrying cost, and then with some probability rate lambda, you will improve your status from being vacant to being occupied. The state of being occupied is in expectation because you don't know whether you're going to have a good or bad tenant. So when you match with a tenant, you're occupied. So the flow value of your being occupied by a good tenant is you get R, which is net rent. It's rent minus the cost of having a tenant in the unit. And then there's some probability, a rate of the tenant leaving, or you kicking them out, that's delta. And then if that happens, then you change your status from being occupied with a good tenant to being vacant. So that's the Bellman equation. It's sometimes fancily called. It's the Bellman equation for a landlord in a good state is this, and so that reduces that expression there. Now, you might have a bad tenant, and you don't find this out until the contract is signed and the tenant moves in. And this is important to keep the model kind of simple, is that neither the tenant nor the landlord knows if they're going to be a good or bad tenant until they move in. And we think this is justified, especially when you talk about our current situation, because the reason people are going to get evicted during the pandemic is not so much because they're a bad tenant, although they might be, but because might lose their job. Okay, when unemployment risk is high, there's a big probability you're going to be a bad tenant, and you don't know whether you're going to lose your job before you move in. At the time you move in, you've probably got a job. The landlord is going to say, "Okay, you have a job. I can let you this apartment." But then you find out you're going to lose your job. Okay, so you don't know. Okay, so if the tenant is bad, this is going to cost you Y, some amount as the landlord. And this is either going to be lost rent if they just can't pay, or it's going to be because it actually is a bad tenant and they're going to, make noise and put holes in the walls of the apartment, or, do damage to the unit. Okay, so when that happens, when you find out it's a bad tenant, you can either keep them or you can evict them. And if you're going to evict them, I think we should do keep here first. If you're going to keep them, then you kind of suck it up and you say, okay, I'm going to take this diminished rent, and then the tenant's going to leave at some point with rate delta, and I'll be able to revert to the vacant state. Here's the key here, is that you might decide to evict And if you evict, you have to pay a cost of D every period. But what that does is it raises the separation rate from delta to delta plus E, or eta, I guess that is. And so there's a trade-off here. Yeah, you get to evict your bad tenant with a raised rate, but you have to pay this amount D at every point in time. And this actually mimics the actual eviction process, certainly in the US, because eviction doesn't happen immediately. You have to often go to court. You have to go through all kinds of legal stuff. You don't know whether it's going to be successful the first time around. And so it's an ongoing process. And we just model that by saying, okay, you have to pay this amount D at every period, but you have that benefit of being able to have a higher rate of eviction. And so that means that you might want to evict and you might not, and it's going to depend on this cost of eviction. And so here's the inequality that says whether or not you're going to be evicting your tenant or not. And so if you look at that carefully, you can see that eviction is chosen when the value of vacancy is higher, when the probability of eviction success is higher, when the secular detachment rate is lower, delta, when delta is lower, because why evict somebody if he's going to leave anyway? When the cost of eviction is lower, when the net rent is lower, that's when you're going to choose eviction. You don't want to evict somebody if they're paying a really high rent. Okay, so the comparative static exercise is a little bit tricky here because we're going to have to assume, we just kind of have to do this, that both D and eta, the two eviction parameters, are exogenous. And so the only way D is going to change the eviction rate is that if D gets low enough so that it changes the eviction rate from 0 when this equality doesn't hold to a value where the equality does hold. So that's a little bit a bit of cheating here to call that a comparative static result, but it does get you at the flavor of what our hypothesis is, which is that if the cost of eviction is higher, there's going to be fewer evictions. Okay, so from here on out, we're going to assume that inequality holds, and if you get a bad tenant, you're going to want to evict them because that makes the rest of this interesting. And so we do a bunch of math here, and the math is meant to get at the value of matching with a tenant, moving from vacancy to occupation, and that's equal to this. Okay, so now tenants have a similar setup. They're either going to be housed or unhoused, and the value of being housed is uncertain because you don't know whether or not you're going to be a good tenant or not. If you are housed, you get benefit Z, and so your net benefit in the flow sense of being housed is this surplus that you get of Z minus R. Then there's a probability that you're going to get kicked out or that you're going to want to separate regardless. And so we have this flow value for the occupied state when you are a good tenant. And you might turn out to be a bad tenant, in which case your rate of departure from the unit is increased by this eta. You still get the same net benefit, and we're assuming here just for simplicity that if you're a bad tenant, you don't incur the cost of Y. In other words, the landlords their return is diminished by this amount Y, but tenants' utility is not diminished by this amount Y. And we justify this assumption both on the grounds that it makes things quite simple, but it also eliminates strategic behavior by the tenants, which gets complicated. I'll come back to this in a second. But since that strategic behavior has been eliminated, there's no reason for a tenant to deliberately withhold rent because they don't get any benefit from this. Sorry, I should have said that a little bit differently. It removes the incentive for tenants to be bad, all right, because they don't get any benefit from being a bad tenant. So that simplifies things quite a lot, but I'll come back to this and show that it actually doesn't make a lot of difference. So we do similar math, and then we get the value of going from being homeless to being housed is this expression here. And the way that these DMP models work is that the tenant and the landlord, potential tenant, the potential landlord meet, they bargain, and they come up with a rent. And the rent is determined by the Nash bargain, which equalizes the gains of trade. So I'm equalizing the gains of trade by from the landlord and that from the tenant. You equalize them, and what that does is it tells you what the rent is only as a function of two endogenous variables, which are the two matching rates. The matching rate for landlords, lambda, and the matching rate for tenants, which is mu. And so that defines a rent function. And then you do a lot of math, but if you take this kind of characterization of rent as being a function of the two matching rates, and you combine that with a zero profit condition, which means that the value of the vacancy is some fixed amount. In other words, this is actually an entry condition. So as long as the value of a vacancy is equal to or greater than this fixed parameter here, you will enter and supply, landlords will enter and supply new units of housing. So that zero profit condition in combination with the rental equation gives you this thing. And so we have a function which is defined only in the two endogenous variables, which in lambda mu space is upward sloping. So that's the first key to getting this theory model to give us predictions. So, and the reason it's upward sloping is that if the landlord matching rate rises, that's going to be beneficial to landlords. They're going to make profit, but there's a zero profit condition, which means that new landlords have to enter the market, which is going to drive profit down, because what that does is it increases the tenant matching rate. It raises mu and changes the bargain that you're going to be able to do with landlords. And so the idea here is, of course, is that landlords want to see a lot of tenants out in the market, because that means that there's more tenants basically than there are landlords, and so that drives up their bargaining position and raises rents. And the opposite is true for tenants. They want to see a lot of landlords in the market and few tenants, because that improves their bargaining position. Okay, so in order to close the model, we say that the quantity of tenants is exogenous at some level t, so that's the population of the housing market. But the quantity of landlords has to be endogenous, because L has to change in order to make the profit, the zero profit condition upheld. Okay, so then the quantity of trades is determined by this matching function. This is a trick that these DMP models use. There's a whole bunch of tenants, there's a whole bunch of landlords, they meet. There's a constant returns to scale technology that allows the landlords and tenants to meet. That technology is constant returns. And so that because it's constant returns to scale, it gives you a matching function, which is downward sloping in lambda mu space. So so both the zero profit condition here and the matching function condition here are both functions in lambda mu space. And so everything arises from a shift in one of the two curves, and the one that shifts in our case is the zero profit function. So you can see here that says steady state. That's wrong. It should be just the matching function. That's downward sloping in mu lambda space, and zero profit condition is upward sloping in mu lambda space. And so equilibrium, single valued equilibrium, is always exists and is unique as long as the matching function, well, if the matching function is in fact Cobb-Douglas or some ordinary function, you're always going to get a unique equilibrium. That the comparative statics of that equilibrium are therefore very easy to see, that if the cost of evictions rises, the zero profit line has to shift up, because when there's a low cost of eviction and it goes to a high cost of eviction, that's going to lower landlord profit. That's going to drive exit, because profit's less than zero. It drives exit on the landlord side from the housing market. That raises The landlord matching rate makes their bargaining position more valuable. At the same time, it's going to lower the tenant matching rate. And so zero profit is restored once you make, with the higher D, a more favorable market for landlords in reaction to that unfavorable shift in the cost of evictions. And so the higher D requires, as I said, all that. So the last piece we need is a steady state, which says that the number of people entering the housed state is equal to the number of people exiting the unhoused state, and the number of landlords exiting the occupied state is equal to the number of vacant units exiting the vacant state. And once you do that, you get some actually remarkably simple expressions for housing supply, so that the rise in eviction cost, D, lowers the housing supply because of its changes in lambda and mu. The homeless rate goes up, and the vacancy rate goes down. So I think that's the theory model. I don't have a lot of time, but let me digress on the non-payment of rent. If tenants can act strategically, they can decide whether or not to pay full rent or not. If Y is exogenous, in other words, it's not itself a strategic variable, it's either going to be 0 or Y, then you can decide whether or not to pay rent, and you'll shirk if this equality is reversed. So if the paying rent is better than risking eviction if this inequality is true, but you'll skimp on rent if it's not. And there's a couple of pages in the paper about this, but I'm not going to go through it here. But in order to, if I just did this, it would make the model completely stupid, because either everybody will skimp on rent or nobody will skip on rent. And so the model breaks down. So then you have to have heterogeneity in Y in order to make the model sensible. And, in the end, you can see in the paper, it doesn't really help with the comparative statics predictions. It just makes the math a lot more complicated. And so we kind of drop that option because it doesn't change the kinds of things we're wanting to test here. Okay, that's the theory model. Let me go maybe a little bit quicker here. I'm sorry I took so much time with that. So, okay, we have a tenant rights index. And so what we do is for the years 1997 to 2016, we get data, hand-collected data on statutes pertaining to landlord-tenant law in each of the 50 states and District of Columbia. We decided very early on to go beyond just looking at eviction statutes and more broadly think about laws that are important for tenant and, for that matter, for landlord protection. So here are the 12 legislative dimensions that we gather data on. And this was really difficult at first, but it turns out there's an annual review of landlord-tenant law that lists all these things. And so we were just able to go to, it's not online, but we bought many back issues of this particular periodical. And so we were able to, in the end, to pretty straightforwardly collect data on all 12 of these laws. Okay, so you can see them here. I won't go through each one of them individually, but there's stuff about whether landlords can evict people on their own, stuff about security deposits, that kind of thing. And so what we do is we line them all up, all right? And we say, okay, if your state is more tenant friendly than average, you get a 1 for that particular law, and a 0 if you are less than or equal to the average tilt of the law towards tenants. All right, and so we do this for every state and DC. And so this is a map of the United States, and it gives the average value of the index over the entire sample period for every state. And the darker the color, the more tenant-friendly the state is. And to my complete wonderment, and I know that the supporters of my real estate center would also be astonished, but California is not the most tenant-friendly state in the country. We tend to think of California as being always on the side of the consumer, and that we're very, very business unfriendly. But we are not in this particular way. The most tenant-friendly states are the ones in New England. That's Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. Rhode Island's actually the top. I guess that's Delaware. And surprisingly enough, Nebraska, which is thought of as being a very conservative state, but in fact is one of the most tenant-friendly in the country. So that was quite a surprise. Generally speaking, the least tenant-friendly states are the ones in the South. There are exceptions, of course. Alabama is relatively tenant-friendly compared to its neighbors, and that's because during this sample period, they actually were the only state to raise their Tenant-Right Index by more than 1. And even the upper Midwest, again, which are thought of as being very conservative, are not that conservative in this respect. And this goes back to the early part of the 20th century. These states here, and Wisconsin too, but they're not in this group, were very populist, and they passed a lot of legislation back during the Great Depression, which was favorable to farmers and keeping farmers from getting evicted from their land. And so that's why these states tend to be very tenant friendly, whereas these newer states are not so. They're conservative, generally speaking, but not so tenant friendly either. I think West Virginia is actually the lowest. No, Utah here, the Mormon state, is the lowest. Okay, now the thing that's going to cause us some difficulty is that actually these indexes don't change very much over time. And among the 50 states, for the time period that we are using here, which is from 2005 or 6 to the present, there is not that many changes. There's a whole bunch of changes in the early part of the millennium. Between 2002 and 2001 and 2004, there were many changes, but we can't use that data because the evictions data that we're going to use doesn't go back that far. So we are limited. One state decreased their index, 7 states increased their index, and Alabama increased it twice during this period. So that's actually going to cause us some trouble later on, but you'll see. When the first time we submitted this paper, which we got rejected, the referees wanted to know whether or not having 12 measures of 12 components of the Tenant Rights Index was redundant. And so the next couple of slides are meant to dissuade you from the fact that they are redundant. So the correlations between them are not that high, especially given the repetition of these things over time. There are some that have correlations of maybe 0.4, but generally they're just not that. There's one that's a bit over that, but they're not that high. And we did some principal component analysis, and we think this also backs up this claim that they are not all that redundant. If you do a principal components analysis, the first principal component explains only about 60%. It has to have 5 components in it, and it still only explains 60%. And so we take this as evidence that, unlike a lot of other principal components analysis you'll see of stuff like this, there's not that much redundancy in these measures. They all tell you something different. That doesn't mean that some of them are not going to be more influential in the regressions that I'm going to show you, but we were right to look at a large number of these laws. Okay, so here's our estimating equation. So we've got these outcome variables, and we're going to regress that on a tenant rights index, some demographic controls, some property controls, and other junk, including, it's not in here, but we're going to have state fixed effects. Of particular interest, especially for the rent model, is the adaptation of this Gainong, I don't pronounce his name very well, Gainong and Shoag measure of land use regulation stringency. So if you follow this literature at all, maybe you don't, there's been a couple of standard measures that try to get at how stringent land use regulation is in different states. There's the Wharton Regulatory Index, and then there's Albert Saiz's inelasticity index. Both of those are strictly cross-section. And so they don't do us much good if we're trying to use panel data. If we only had cross-section, then we wouldn't be able to include state fixed effects. But this paper by Ganong and Shoag, which actually looks at convergence, or actually divergence in US states, they developed another measure of land use regulation stringency, which is the year-by-year, state-by-state count of lawsuits that mention the word land use. And so this is actually, so there are these lawsuit indexes, legal action indexes that you can just go and look up for any state in every year. And you put a search term of land use in there and you can figure out how many lawsuits were brought having to do with land use. And so this is, because this is available by state and by year, it's a pretty clever mechanism for getting at a time varying measure of the stringency. So there's that's some stuff. That's the summary statistics. See, the Tenant-Right Index has a mean of 5.54. Yeah, I guess there's nothing particularly interesting there. So here's evictions. So the darker the color, the more evictions there are per capita in each state. And you can see there's kind of a relationship. Here's some states. And so the circle is the size of the tenant rights index. So the bigger the circle, the higher the index. So lower the index. So more evictions occur in states with greater landlord protection. So to the regressions. All right. So here's OLS. And so we're just running that regression with many of the control variables that you saw in the previous slide. We look at two outcomes with respect to evictions. We look at the eviction filing rate. So let me digress for just a second here. What Desmond did was he scraped courtroom records and looked for cases that involved, and so found out how many evictions, because evictions, you normally go to court, right? You have to go to court in order to get somebody evicted. So he went to every courthouse in every city, basically, in the country and found out how many eviction cases were being filed each year in each city. So that's city-specific data, not states. And so we have the filing rate, and then we have the outcome, which is the eviction rate. So filing rate, you don't really get anything from the regression. You find that higher tenant rights means more filings, which is actually evidence against the screening hypothesis, but it's not statistically significant, so we don't make any claims about that. But evictions are harder. The higher the tenant right index, the lower the eviction rate. Right? And we break the laws down into three categories, and you can see here that in this particular case, it's the eviction laws themselves that are doing the work. And so the coefficient jumps. I'm not sure these are comparable because I don't think the index is measured the same way. I have to check with my co-authors on that. But in any case, it does seem to be that the eviction laws are doing the work to reduce the number of evictions. And so we have a whole bunch of controls. We have state fixed effects. And so we're relying, econometrically, what we're doing here is we're relying on those 7 or 8 different changes in the eviction rate in those few states to drive this result. Yeah, so that's pretty powerful, actually. So we're pretty pleased with that. However, state fixed effects, we always want to have state fixed effects, because what that's going to do is that's going to control for every time invariant potential correlate. So there can be lots of challenges to identification of the causal impact of the tenants' rights index. And a lot of those are going to be time invariant just because of the nature of the state, sunny or not, coastal or not, that kind of thing. So state fixed effects are basically 50 variables that cover all of that. But why did Alabama in 2004 increase its tenants' rights index, pass legislation that was more favorable to tenants? Was there something that we're not observing that's common to all of those changes that we don't see in our covariance? If there is, and we don't do anything, then we cannot ascribe causality to the tenant rights index. So we need an instrument. We're going to use instrumental variables. So we're going to instrument the index with a lagged by 1 year Google search on the term landlord-tenant law. We do this for the term evictions as well. The results don't change. So what this is doing, we think, is telling us what public attitudes about evictions are, and that those public attitudes are going to change after a lag, the tenant rights index. Okay, so because it's lagged, it's not going to be correlated with current housing market outcomes, but it is going to serve as a causal variable for changes in the tenants rights index. Okay. We also use lagged Democrat percentage of the presidential vote. This is not such a great instrument, I don't think, from a theoretical point of view. We include it as a causal factor for the tenant rights index because we want the model to be over-identified, because we think people will be suspicious of our instruments. And so if we're over-identified, we can test the over-identification restriction. I mean, this is not particularly important, I don't think, but the parameters do in fact satisfy the over-identification test, and they are not weak. And so we do the IV estimation, and we see, first of all, that this Google search index is in fact a powerful determinant of the tenant rights index. That's the first stage of the two-stage IV procedure. And then we find that the tenant right index remains as a causal, now we claim, causal factor in the reduction of the eviction rate. And so if you're going to notice, this thing's much bigger. And in some sense, that's great, because it says we have a very powerful model that tells us about how big changes in the eviction rates are going to come out. You know, but we're still a little bit queasy about this because this is almost too good to be true. But we do have this result that is predicted by our theory model, is predicted by common sense, and is verified in the data that a greater amount of tenant rights is going to reduce evictions. Okay, so then we apply this to rent with all the controls we talked about before. And indeed, a greater level of tenant rights increases the rents, both in the OLS version of the model and in the instrumental variables version of the model. So again, we have the same kind of result, which is that it's basically twice the effect in the OLS of the eviction loss. That's almost exactly the same as what happened here. And so again, its results great. It tells us what we thought was going to happen actually did happen, but it's almost too good to be true. So we're still investigating. We're still trying to figure out exactly where these results come from. But you know, it does tell us what we think is important, important outcome. That greater tenant protections raise rents, of course. Okay, the last three outcomes, the tenant rights index, this again is an instrumental variable procedure. Greater tenant rights reduces rental supply. It lowers the vacancy rate, which is, these things are both unfavorable to tenants, right? It's the same thing as rent in that landlords have to be made better off because you're making them worse off by reducing their power to evict. The homeless rate is less clear. This is not the sign that we were expecting from the theoretical model. I expect this to be positive because you're reducing the housing supply, and that's going to keep more people homeless. But we think kind of that there's a difference between the equilibrium outcome that's predicted by the theory model and the transition to that equilibrium. When you raise tenant rights, you're reducing evictions, and that's going to lower the homeless rate. But the housing supply factor is going to increase the homeless rate. And so maybe those two things are balancing out. We're basically getting nothing here. So that's it. So here's what we've done. We've constructed a theoretical model that predicts all these things. We empirically model the cost of eviction by creating this tenant rights index. We estimate fixed effects IB models, and the model's predictions are confirmed except for the homeless thing. Regulations have both positive and negative effects. And so in the paper somewhere, we talk about the delicate balance between these effects and how lawmakers have to make policy that kind of threads the needle. And just as a cautionary note, because as we've publicized this paper, we get asked all the time about this. We don't think this says very much about the current eviction moratorium that the United States has undergone, because there's other things going on. I mentioned them earlier. Other things going on that suggest that maybe this eviction moratorium is actually a good idea for reasons that we don't address in the model. So I'm done. Thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome comments or questions. Marco?
Okay, thank you, Edward, for very inspiring presentation. And
I said I would finish before an hour, and I almost made it.
You're great. So you're in time. So there is Alessandra. She's able to be here. So probably Alessandra would like to start the first round of questions or comments, and then we could have a break. Alessandra?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Alessandra.
I joined actually 15-20 minutes after you started. I managed to actually get rid of the other people in the other meeting.
Lovely. I'm glad you could make it. So pleased.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I couldn't actually chair it at the beginning, but I had a very valid substitute. First of all, thank you very much for joining us in this webinar and for your presentation, which was great. I don't know if I've ever told you, although we know each other for a while now, that my parents are actually real estate agents and mortgage brokers. So,
Really?
I grew up listening to them talking about tenants, right? And it brought me back. In fact, during university, I even worked with them, to kind of try and do something useful aside from studying economics. Anyway. So I have one question which is more general, and then another kind of question, curiosity, which is linked more to geography, because as you know, I'm really keen on this regional stuff. So you have this index, right, of the tenant rights, which is very fascinating. And I was just wondering about Italy. I have this feeling that in Italy, tenants have a lot of rights, but maybe I'm wrong. So now I'm going to look for data and see if we can find something similar. I don't know.
Well, so I referenced a paper very early on by Coulson. If you can still see my screen.
Yeah.
There's a paper that looks at cross-country data for OECD countries. It's this last one, Coladilin et al. Okay, so
do they find that Italy is strict or not?
I don't remember.
Oh, okay.
I didn't read it. Isn't that terrible? I didn't read that paper. I only found it a few days ago.
No, but I'm actually writing it down because out of curiosity, I would like to see whether my feeling is actually right or wrong, which I don't know. But I was wondering, are there any data on how long on average it takes to evict a tenant?
I don't remember that being in Desmond's work. If it's in anywhere, it's in Desmond's work, but it's definitely not instantaneous.
Okay.
It's a matter of weeks to months is my general impression.
Because in Italy, my general impression that it's even longer than that. And I was just wondering but I don't know if there are the data, if that could be a way of testing the Tenant-Right Index, because this should be correlated to how long it takes you on average to actually evict somebody from the house. But then I don't know if there are data or not. But this is because I'm thinking of how long it takes in Italy, and that would be my first, the first measure that would come to mind to me, to look at how long does it take. If it takes years, which is could be the case. Okay, that was more general. The second is about the geography. Okay, so you have these very strong results, great instrument, and you find this relationship. But I've noticed two things, two clusters that were interesting to me. One was the area of Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, where you seem to have white and white in the maps, right? So it goes against...
And in the population.
And in the population, that's true. I mean, density of population is very low, but everything is normalized, right? So population shouldn't have an effect. And I was just wondering, these are your outliers in a sense. They go against your general results, right? Because they're not white and black. They are both in the same direction. Do you have a general sense of why these? So Utah, that is doesn't have a very high value of the Tenant-Right Index, but they don't have eviction either. Is it cultural? Do you have a sense
Right.
of why?
I don't know. We don't. Actually, we do have data on religion. I think we haven't used it. They are low density places.
Yes, that's true.
The density is in the empirical model.
Okay.
So we're controlling for density. Other than that, I don't have a good answer for you. But you're certainly right.
I was just wondering. Because
yeah, I don't know.
you do control for public attitudes, right? And I was wondering exactly, in your instrument, you look at the fixed effect, and this is what I was thinking of. And then you look at public attitudes, which is great. But still, I see this cluster over there, and you're right. It is low density, but you do have density in the model. So there has to be something else. For Utah, I thought about religion, but I don't know about the other places, if they're very religious or not. I know they have natural parks, but I doubt that there is anything to do with that.
There's a lot of Mormon spillover to
right.
neighboring states. I don't know if that has any.
It's a Mormons effect, probably.
Yeah, maybe. It's always quite dangerous to kind of generalize about.
No, I know.
States, and so I was
really joking, but I've not. And the second thing is, so the southern states, here you have a very clear relationship that goes on this exactly as you want. So you have the high tenant rights index and low tenant rights index, and you have high evictions, right? They're very dark. I was just wondering, how does this relate to poverty? Because these states are poor, and in general, maybe not Florida, because they have a lot of people that are retiring there. But do they go together in the sense that where you have a lot of poor people, and hence that maybe a lot of them might not be able to pay rent, then you lower the tenant rights to give more flexibility to the market, and so you evict them. But how does poverty enter into all this picture, or inequality?
So inequality. We have measures. We have average income, and we have income growth in there as well. But something so I'm going to answer your question indirectly, because you said something about inequality.
Yes.
And I think that's the next empirical step, is to do two things. One is to look at not just average income, but some other measures of the income distribution, and to not look at median rent, because that's not median rent's not relevant for people who are getting evicted. So we want to look at the 20th or 30th percentile of rent and the 20th, 30th percentile of income. That's been suggested to us before, and I think that's an obvious next step for us.
Yeah, but anyway, great presentation. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alessandra. I also have a comment that is related to Alessandra's point about the time for evict people, because in Italy, for personal reason, I know a bit about the time for the evictions in Italy, and in the easiest case, so that means that tenants do not make any opposition. It takes at least 1 hour, 1 year.
Wow.
Otherwise, if tenants make some opposition, it could stand for even 2 years. So it depends. So I think it's quite different. And this point make me let me arise questions about your. Because if I'm not wrong, so maybe I didn't see in the slide, so you don't have any consideration about the duration of the contract, for instance, in the sense that if the tenant is at the middle of the contract of the housing contract, so the cost related also to the time, to the period that is necessary to evict the people could be in relative term could be higher or less according also to tenants' rights.
Right.
So this could be something that could make some differences in the choices of pay or not pay, or make damage or not damage.
Right. So this is aggregate data. So we're looking at data, some cases by city and some cases by state. That probably wasn't clear in the presentation. There is very little data, and it's all very recent, on rent fulfillment. In other words, what percentage of people in each city or state are not paying the rent. We have data on that, but it's only been collected for the past year or two, so we have not used that. But that would be, of course, extremely important component of a broader study of this phenomenon.
Okay, I think
So we don't have data. We're not using individual lease data. That was what Ambrose and Diop did, but that data ends in 2010. Their data ends, so it's not current at all.
Okay. So Edward, I think we can change a bit the format. So if you agree, we could, since we already started discussion on your work, so we can go on with the questions and comments without a break.
I'm good.
Okay, perfect. So any other comments from the audience? You could raise your hands and you're allowed to talk. Otherwise, I can keep on with the questions and comments, because I have of comments and questions because it's a very interesting topic. One of the first questions that arise to my mind is that at the very beginning you mentioned that if the tenant is bad, then happens some issues. So, and then you explain that for you, bad is you have 2 points basically, or the tenant does not pay the rent, or the tenant makes some damages to the houses. Mm-hmm. And again, if I'm not wrong, then you focus only on the damage part, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And my question is that tenants, they have to pay they have some cost for the eviction process, in the sense that if you make some judgment about that, there is a process or whatever. So they have to pay a lawyer, they have some costs related to the eviction process. For instance, in Italy, this is one of the reasons why tenants typically do not make any opposition to the evictions, because otherwise they have to pay a lawyer. But this is something that could be also relevant for the cost, not only of the landlord, but also for the tenants.
Right. Yeah, in the U.S., there are, in most places, public interest lawyers that are glad to take on eviction cases. Okay. Because we have this system, maybe this is true in Italy too, of contingency fees. So you sue your landlord and you don't pay your lawyer until you get judgment in your favor. And so lawyers are always eager to take on cases where you can sue somebody. But you do make a good point that tenants do incur cost when they do damage or don't pay, and they forfeit their security deposits. that's certainly true. I sort of think of the Y parameter as part of that. When see in the main model, tenants just are passive. They don't make decisions. It's only when we allow them to act strategically that these kinds of considerations come in. And once you let one of those complications in the door, so to speak, the model just becomes extremely complicated. And after a lot of struggle with this, I just decided that this was not worth, turning a theory model into a paper by itself. That was not the point of the theory model. It was just meant to set up what we do with the empirics, which are the important part. So I just decided that that's not relevant. But you're absolutely right. And in a more well-developed, realistic model, I would be taking those kinds of things into account.
Thank you. There is a question from Masoud Ghazi. He's a postdoc at the JSSI. So Masoud?
Do you hear me, Marco?
Yes, perfectly.
Great. So thank you very much for your presentation. I really liked it. It's very inspiring. I have two questions, actually. My first question relates to the principal component analysis. You've done that to see how they're clustering, the variation as well. But how did you perform that, the principal component analysis? Because it's a panel data and you have different years. Have you done it by year and then you took the average, or it's done on the pool?
No, sorry, go ahead, please.
Yeah, sorry. So this is the first question. The second question is related to the selection bias. Do you think that you suffer from the selection bias because of the data and the limitation on the data? Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. Great questions. I'm 90%. I didn't actually hit the stata commands on this, but my co-author did this, and I'm 99% sure that it's just as it comes, treating each observation as a separate contribution to the principal component analysis. And that's actually why I think our results are striking, in the sense that if it were, since we have all this kind of sticky over time data, that I would have expected that the principal component analysis would give stronger indications of redundancy. I don't think we see that. Reasonable people can differ about this, but I don't think we're seeing a lot of redundancy there. But I'll check on that. We should actually put that in the paper. So selection bias, if I'm interpreting the question correctly, I would interpret that, I would respond to it by talking about our treatment of that there's an endogenous change in the tenant rights index over time. That's the selection bias we need to worry about. That the selection bias is that states select themselves into a higher tenant rights index category because of unobserved correlates. And so that's why we think that while we have state fixed effects, which account for an awful lot of that selection bias, that there's a little bit left over because there can be changes in those unobserved correlates that we just basically are calling attitudes towards tenant-landlord law. And those things can change. And when they change, states select themselves into that higher category, want to model that change, and so account for the selection bias. And we do it by actually trying to get an observable on the changes in attitudes. And that's where the Google search term comes in, that we want that's accounting for the selection bias as states select themselves into different categories. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sure.
That makes sense.
Okay, there is another question from Margherita Grazioli. She's another postdoc at the JSSI. Margherita is also looking at the YouTube page, so I don't know if this question is from YouTube or is from Margherita. So Margherita, you can.
Thank you. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, no, there are no questions from YouTube, at least yet. So the question would be from me. Thanks, thanks, Heather, for your presentation. It was extremely interesting and timely. I would like to read and possibly discuss more about what's going on with the pandemic right now, and even what will happen when the eviction moratorias will be eventually lifted, because obviously this cannot go on forever. This debate is ongoing also in Italy. So this was more of a comment, but obviously something that it's difficult to predict right now. So I would go to a question about something we can actually observe. And I was wondering if you've had the chance to consider or incorporate into the index the distortion that can be determined both on the market price and the housing supply by phenomena like gentrification of specific area, or even the presence of the large presence of short rental platforms like Airbnb that tend to decrease significantly the available housing stock, and they have an impact. They may have an impact on the rental market. At least this is something we have observed in Italy, in many, especially in big cities. So I was wondering if you've had the chance to consider these two phenomena when creating your index. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a great question. And a great set of ideas. We've talked about it, not so much as an addition to the index itself, but as a control variable. Because if you're in a high tourist area, or in a very pleasing area, you'll want to evict your sitting tenants because you know you're going to get a higher rent from the next one, whether that's just because it's a higher income person, if it's gentrification, or you're going to get this series of high paying short-term renters through Airbnb. And so we need a control variable or two to kind of get at those kinds of phenomena. That's actually a very important point. And I'm very glad you brought that up, because that's something we're definitely going to have to think about. We do know that Airbnb is having tremendous impact on rental property in certain cities. It was. I mean, maybe not so much in the last 6 months, but New York, Manhattan in particular, had a lot of issues with Airbnb. So does Los Angeles, where I live. So, yeah, thank you very much. Great question.
Hey, thank you, Margherita. I also have to apologize because I didn't mention how to do the question for the people, especially for the people outside the GSSI. They should put the questions in the chat, or they could ask to make a question in the chat, and then I could allow the attendees to make a question. So sorry if I didn't mention before. So if there are other questions, if not, okay, there is Sandro Montresore. Sandro is professor at the GSSI. Sandro? Sandro, you're still...
Can you hear me there? Can you hear me now?
Yes, now, yes.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Ed. It's a really interesting presentation. I've got a question. I don't know whether it is already that, and if so, please apologize me. The question is, to which extent would the implications of a model change if the index of cost of eviction would become common knowledge to the players of a model that is known to them?
It is known. It's exogenous and it's known.
It is exogenous. So what about if a social planner would get a kind of index and disclose to the players?
You open another can of worms. what our big ambition for this is to simulate the model and be able to determine for a social planner what the optimal cost of regulation is. And one of the things we're going to need for that, of course, is something that was brought up earlier, which is the length of time it takes to evict people, which we don't have. It's not part of our model. It's not part of our empirical work, but that will tell us what the eviction parameters are. So it will tell us what eta is in the model, and then we can use the results of the empirics once we get those nailed down completely, and allow us to simulate various outcomes, simulate the welfare of the landlords and the tenants, and determine an optimal D, so an optimal amount of tenant regulation. That's an ambition that we have. We'll see how far that goes.
Okay, that will be interesting.
Okay, thank you, Sandro. Other questions from the audience? Otherwise, I can have another of my questions. Yeah, I can go ahead. I think so. Okay, another point is that, at least for me, one of the implications of your work is that you mentioned that you found lower vacancy rate. But also that you find that when you have higher tenants' rights, you find also a reduction in the rental housing supply, right? By the way, I'm wondering if this is something in absolute terms or in relative terms, in the sense that if you have a lower vacancy rate, okay, especially from the supply side. When you said that you have a reduction in the rental housing supply, it means that you have a reduction in the numbers of the houses that are free to rent in the market, or there is also the possibility that landlords, since the tenant rights are higher, they don't want to rent their houses. In the sense, the house is out of the market in that case. Because in the second case, probably the reduction that you can find is not because you have a higher number of lower number of houses, by the way, that you have a lower number of houses in the market. So I don't know if I make
no. So this question has come up before. What do we mean by a reduction in the housing supply? So the way, I'll answer it in a couple of different ways. The way we measure it is we look at the number of households that are renting units and plus the number of vacant units, just as it's defined in the paper and the theory model, actually. And so when we say reduction, because in the empirical model, because the model is identified only from changes in the tenant rights index. So we're not actually, when you come right down to it, we're not actually measuring the effects of the tenant right index from the cross section. In other words, state to state differences. We're only really in the end measuring it through those changes that some states have. And so all of these outcomes are short-run outcomes. And so it must be what you said the second thing was, which was that there were units out there and they're being withdrawn from the market. And so there's three ways that happens. One is building's old and it gets torn down and people get evicted and the landlord does this, we're saying, basically in part because they're not making as much money because the tenant rights index is higher. So certain buildings become less than zero profit and they're withdrawn. The other is converting to Airbnb. Another is converting it to owner occupied. In other words, taking a building and making it condo. A lot of people, rent out, units within their own house. That's being withdrawn. And there is delays in bringing brand new rental housing supply to the market. So all these things can contribute. We don't have any sense of what the most prevalent reason for withdrawing housing supply is. It can be a combination of a lot of those things. It might be worth our time to try and figure that out. So that's a great question.
Okay, thank you. Other questions from the audience? Otherwise, I have another couple of questions that are related. So if there are no other questions from the audience, I could ask my last two questions, and then I promise I shut up.
You ask great questions. Don't be shy. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. There are maybe 2 points, but I don't know if this is related or not. But I put together. So in the literature of the housing markets, there is some debated law that basically said that if the number of the home ownership is higher, then you have an impact on the labor markets, because probably there is a much more difficulty in moving to a place to another to find a job.
I've written on that a lot, actually.
Okay, and this could be also something that could be related to tenants' rights, in the sense that probably if you, I don't know, if you put some barriers in the tenants' rights or in the ability to evict people, basically, because we are talking about that, probably you could also have some impact in the labor market somehow. It's also true that you could also have the reverse situation, that you have some like the last financial crisis in 2008. You have a huge impact on the labor market that could be that can affect the tenant rights in somehow, or the asking requirement for a much more higher tenant rights. And this is one of the first point. And the other point that I still don't know if this is related to the first point is that in your empirical model, you don't have any measure of income inequality.
Of what? I'm sorry, of what quality?
Of income inequality.
Oh, right. Yes, of course.
That could be something that an important control, because okay, you solve the endogeneity issues and so on, but if there are states where the income inequality is higher, you could have two different effects, or that landlords are much more powerful, so the tenant rights are lower, or on the other way around, the poor people, they could ask for more rights, so then they would ask for much more tenant rights. In this sense, you could also have some different effect. So maybe it could be interesting to control also for income inequality.
Right. I actually, so I'll take the second one first. You're absolutely right that income inequality is increasing, and the increase is different by state. So there are state differences in 90-10, or the interquartile ratio of income. So that may play a role. And something that Alessandra, I think, asked earlier is that one of the things we would need to do is therefore not look at averages, but look at maybe the 30th percentile of income. Because that's, the average person is not getting kicked out of their apartment. The average person is not being evicted. So the average rent is maybe not so relevant here. So yeah, we definitely need to do that. Your first question is very pertinent, because I've written 2 or 3 papers on the relationship between home ownership and labor market outcomes. And the gist of that is that whether you're a renter or an owner, what you need is stability. And what employers want to see is stability. So employers enter markets where there's a high home ownership rate. We know that. And the reason they want to do that is because homeowners are stable. And so that actually puts employers in a better bargaining position. One of my papers has the remarkable result that the higher the home ownership, the lower the wage, because it's hard for homeowners to move. And because it's hard for homeowners to move, that puts employers in a better bargaining position, and so it lowers wages. I think that's kind of an interesting result, but it does mean that employment's going to be higher in those places too. So now if you put that in the rental market, so the same thing can apply to renters. It works a little bit differently because it's not hard for renters to move in that sense. But if you're going to get evicted, if eviction laws are easy for landlords in a place, employers are not going to enter that market, because if the tenants are going to get kicked out, they're going to move and they're not going to stay with the firm. So it's a very, so what employers want is stability, and eviction, higher tenant rights gives that stability. And, so there may be some interesting implications from that kind of general equilibrium model. Very interesting.
Thank you.
I hadn't thought of that before, but you're quite right.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, there are other questions or comments.
Marco, sorry, can I just say thank you again for Ed,
Okay.
because the discussion also was great. And, you were very patient. You really were generous with your time. So we are all appreciating it. It was
my
really
pleasure.
great. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I really enjoyed myself here. I got a lot of great comments, and really appreciate everybody's insights into what we're doing. So thank you very much. I see that Kara Kockelman's coming next week.
Yes.
So that I've seen that paper, and that's a great paper. And so say hi to Kara from me. And,
we will, and you can always join if you want. These are free for everybody.
Send me an invitation. Maybe if I can get up early. What time is her? She's in Central Time, so it may be too early for even me.
I don't know what time is. No, I think it's more or less this time. It's always kind of late afternoon, so you might be up, but you are right that you are on the other side of the world. But
so
yes,
send me the invitation. I would love to see the paper again.
We will for sure. Sandro, you wanted to say something?
No, it is at 5 o'clock here.
Okay,
even better.
Yeah, it's better. My goodness, I'll actually be awake.
Later than you.
Yeah. Perfect.
Thank you very much, Ed. Sorry, I let Marco conclude because actually I'm not the chair.
Yeah, but Alessandro, you did a great job, because I was saying the same thing, but you did better than me. So thank you, Edward, really much for your time and for your presentation. I said again, this is I think a very interesting and great work. So thank you again for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure talking with everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.